Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here, especially for the kind of event that really tries to organize collaborative thinking. So thank you very much to Susanna and Sebastian and the other organizers for bringing us all together. Erin and I decided to give you two different takes on the same concept, which is the concept of immediation. It's a concept that we've worked on collectively at the Sense Lab for many years, both in practice and in theory. And the Sense Lab has a collective book on the topic that will be published soon at Open Humanities Press. The project a little bit sort of got away with us, and it ended up being 2 volumes rather than 1, but that should be out in a month or so. So what we thought we'd do today is I will talk first, just giving some sort of background moving into the concept of immediation, and then Erin will talk a little bit more in terms of the political implications. And what I want to talk about is moving toward a model of internal relations, moving from a concept of mediation, which works with external relation. But I don't think there's probably a better way of summarizing what we'll both be saying than what Sebastian said as a kind of rallying cry at the beginning, which was, don't judge, make exist. Okay? It could not be clearer. Quote, "The elucidation of immediate experience is the sole justification for any thought." In a single phrase, Alfred North Whitehead sweeps a venerable concept off the table, mediation. But Whitehead also phrases the same admonition differently. We must, he says, confine ourselves to that which communicates with immediate matter of fact, because what does not so communicate is unknowable. These quotes announce that in the process philosophy advocated by Whitehead, immediation is not to be taken as the opposite of communication. The elucidation of immediate experience actually requires a concept of communication, which is to say, transmission. Where transmission goes, some notion of medium is bound to follow. But what manner of medium is this? Which concept of communication are we talking about? How can transmission inhabit immediacy? It is necessary to construct a robust concept of immediation equal to the needs of a process-oriented take on the world in order to begin to answer these questions. This is a bit of a false advertising because in what I'm going to present, I actually don't get to the part on how transmission works in a philosophy of mediation, but I just get to the beginning. The operation of mediation is almost universally understood in terms of an intervening third. The model of the intervening third is as simple as the idea of an apparatus of communication viewed as interposing itself between the sender and the receiver. Its coming between as a third term tasked with ensuring the conditions of possibility for communication places the parties in communication in a relation of exteriority to one another. This fashions social relation as external relation, an interaction between two, mediated by an intervening third. Mediation's being in the middle is understood in these terms as pertaining to external relation. This is relation as an added factor constituted by an intervening third coming between two discrete points, joining them at a distance through its own devices. This has far-reaching philosophical consequences. The gravest of those consequences for a process-oriented approach is that it writes immanence out of the question. As we will see, immanence and immediation are a package deal. One cannot be conceived without the other. Immanence, by contrast, is not a concern for mediation. Charles Sanders Peirce makes mediation one of the metaphysical pillars of his triadic philosophy. He uses mediation, and sometimes medium, as a synonym for his category of thirdness. Despite the name, Peirce makes it crystal clear that mediation does not imply an intervening third as a separable element. Calling it mediation is misleading in light of today's usage of the word. For Peirce, what defines what he calls genuine thirdness, as opposed to an intervening third, is a condition of inseparability. Thirdness designates the indissolubility of a coming together. Calling this relation would be much more intuitive and would have the added benefit of signaling the pivotal status of the concept as the linchpin of the logic of relation that Peirce considered one of his chief contributions to philosophy. Relation is indissoluble because if it is possible to decompose a phenomenon into separate elements and still have the same phenomenon, what you're dealing with is a collection. A collection is when elements are discrete from one another, a mere disjunctive multiplicity. Their natures are not in play simply by the fact that they come together. The connection between them is extrinsic to their natures. It is a merely accidental circumstance. The between of them has no particular consistency, no thickness proper to it, no nature of its own, in which their natures are called upon to participate in a way that changes them. The relation, in a word, is external. External relation, according to Peirce, is degenerate thirdness, or mere mixture. It corresponds to what nowadays we call interaction, a term with which discourses on media are rife. Interaction is the thin between. In genuine thirdness, the in-between has a thickness that requires a participation that goes to the heart of what the participating elements are and what they can do. Entering into relation changes their natures. This entails, conversely, that removing them from their coming together will change their natures again. In a favorite phrase of Deleuze and Guattari's, they cannot be divided without changing in nature. This nature-changing participation, where the very definition of what a thing is and the spectrum of what it can do is at stake in what is meant by internal relation. This term does not at all mean that the relation is inside, confined by an interiority. Quite the opposite. It means that the inside comes out. The thing sends its very nature on an adventure in the world, taking a wager on what else it can be. Internal relation is involvement in an event, and the event constitutes a becoming. It is the elements coming together that are in the relation. It is not the relation that is in something else. This is another way of saying that the concept of internal relation is a concept of immanence. Internal relation is the mutual immanence of the multiple in the singularity of a changeful event. Immanence is when things come out of themselves to come together. It is the shared outside of what they collectively come into to become through. This changes the meaning of between. Between is no longer the external distance separating two things. It is co-involvement, a participation that brings things together in change. Between is a being outside together, being in the midst of a shared becoming. Becoming comes through the middle. The middle is not passively circumscribed by the external relation between things. It is an active middling that takes things up together into itself toward change. It is the direct implication of a multiplicity of natures in each other, across any actual distance separating them. All immediacy is in the middle, and all middling is in immediacy. The between is not an actual distance. It is the absolute proximity to each element, and by the same token, to them all, of an implication in the event of change, integrally shared. This makes the relation a locus of sorts, but not one that can be pinpointed in space. It is the locus where what is localized in space participates non-locally in immediacy. This means that it is by nature abstract or ideal, as much of the order of the virtual as the actual. Take love as an example. The love relation is not decomposable into two separate people, both of whom are busy, each on their own side, executing the action of loving. This would make love a collection of two dual relations, that of each individual to love. The feeling of love, rather, is a direct involvement in another's life in a way that adds a supplement to your life that you cannot put your finger on because it is neither here nor there, or rather, it is always here and there wherever you go. Unlocalizable as it is, just as unlocalizable as it is, you feel it directly without having to think about it. You also know just as directly that it will draw you into an adventure that will not leave you unchanged. Love is not an interaction between two living beings. It is an intermodulation between two lives. It takes off from what they are, each on their own side, in order to sweep them up toward what they will become together. Love is not 1 + 1 = 2. It is a strange, vital mathematics where 1 + 1 = 3. The third is the becoming. This is a third that exceeds addition. It is more a kind of fusion. The one and the other cease to be a collection of two. Instead, they move together across their distance and difference integrally as a block, their movements correlated even when they are apart. They're entangled, not unlike quantum particles. To paraphrase Whitehead, the world of two becomes one, and it is increased by one, making three. This fusion is not an erasure of distance and difference. It is a supplementation of them, a real but abstract thirdness of co-evolvement. Every couple's coupleness has its own affective complexion, which can be felt and responded to, supplementary to any one-to-one interaction you may have with either party. There is a being of relation. Anyone who is friends with a couple knows that implicitly. The relation is an incorporeal being that has its own personality, irreducible to the personalities in love. It is not a mere convention of speech to say in love. The being of the relation is a kind of ideal locus, defined by what Raymond Rouillère calls a non-local liaison. You're still in love when you are apart. The same logic applies to situations involving three parties. For example, in polyamory. Polyamorous relations are not decomposable into two sets of dual relations because each relation cannot fail to be modulated by the other, even if the choice is made to maintain a certain distance between them, a certain separation between them. The between of the relation is a non-decomposable among. It goes between all of the terms in relation at one and the same time. It's not a straight line from one to the other, plus a straight line from that other to another. It's an abstract line that snakes in a zigzag between all the terms at once, filling the intervals with its own ideal thickness at no remove and no delay. The thickness or intensity can be variable. To say that integration does not erase difference and distance is to say that it applies to a differential, and that the differential is never surpassed but rather supplemented. Differentiation and integration are two sides of the same coin. People in love become together, but they do so without becoming the same or becoming in the same way. Love relationships are notoriously asymmetrical. Another example of a thirdness involving co-involved parties is the gift. From the interactive point of view, giving is decomposable into a dual relation between the giver and the gift, a proffering, plus another dual relation between the gift and the giftee, receiving. However, this is only an event of giving because the action of proffering coincides with the action of receiving. They overlap in the event, entering into continuity with one another. If the giftee refuses the gift, the gesture of proffering is abruptly sundered from the receiving, and both parties break from the gift relation. The two actions fall into separation. Their reciprocity is broken. In a true giving, proffering and receiving are reciprocals, integrally intertwined. They are fused aspects of a single action that fills the distance between the two participants with a quality of relation, in the thick of which their lives are moving forward. You can't decompose the gestures into two dual relations without losing the quality of the relation. There is, of course, a distance between the two participants, but there is no distance between the two gestures. They occupy the same abstract locus, which is the relation of giving. There are many profferings that are not of gifts, and the same goes for receivings. Exchange has many faces. If you approach giving as an interaction between two individuals mediated by the gift object as intervening third, passing from one dual relation pertaining to one individual to another dual relation pertaining to the other, you deprive yourself of any way of distinguishing intrinsically between different kinds of profferings and receivings. Divorced from the singular quality of the exchange, the actions look the same. They're basically identical. One arm extends, the other extends to meet it, something passes hand to hand. Looked at as isolated actions, there's nothing to differentiate receiving a gift from receiving a hand-me-down piece of clothing, for that matter, or for that matter, from a cashier receiving cash for a purchase. The profferings and receivings involved display the same general form. Given that common form, in order to differentiate between events, you have to appeal to extrinsic factors. An obvious way of doing this is to situate the exchange, for example, by appealing to how it is framed by external circumstance. The problem is that from the relational point of view, circumstance does not frame the relation. It enters into it, and its ingression exerts a force, a fusion. The circumstances are an operator of the fusion, along with such things as intention, nuances of posture and facial expression, the presence of corroborating signs such as decorative wrapping, and the flair with which the act is performed. The integrality of the relation, the way these relational operators come together as one event, carries a felt quality all its own. Oh, sorry, it jumped. It is this felt quality that distinguishes this event from other events of proffering and receiving. The felt quality expresses an intrinsic difference, endowing the act with its own event personality. It marks the immanence of the relation, the fact that the contributory factors or relational operators are in on it together, reciprocal co-conspirators, inseparably bound, as good as one for all the event cares, but still very much themselves from the point of view of the differential of their asymmetric involvement in the integral event. As these examples show, immediation, understood through a philosophy of relation, is vitally concerned with qualitative difference. The singular feeling tone of events is foreground. That qualitative difference is expressive of internal relation directly felt. The notion of fusion points to the immediate reality of the relation and underlines the event that is composed of differences coming to coincide, coming into continuity with each other, without their difference being erased. Immediation, to paraphrase Whitehead, concerns the becoming of continuity. Continuity is often understood in terms of indifference. Here we find ourselves called upon to link it integrally to difference. The relation takes up the difference in nature between its multiple contributory forces and supplements that differential with the expression of the emergent thirdness of a singular qualitative difference characterizing this event in an immediacy of feeling. The immediacy of feeling comes with a rush of immediate transition, Whitehead says. Being taken up in a rush of relation of given, being taken up in the rush of relation of love, again for this moment. It is this immediate rush that philosophy should confine itself to. In Immediation, transition precedes transmission. Things are not in transmission because things are not in transition when they're being transmitted. There is transmission when things make a transition. The past, selectively reactivated, transitions into the present. Or to put it more precisely again, when the force of present circumstance draws past potentials forward to meet future potential, transition occurs. A charge of pastness fused with the force of futurity carries across in between, which is constituted by that very movement. To say that transition precedes transmission means that transition is, processually, primary in relation to transmission. Transmission is a derivative of the thickness of a transition. This turns the whole model of mediation on its head in more ways than one. In mediation, the present is mediated by the determinations of the past. In a mediation, the past is mediated by the present, in the sense that it is the constitution of the present that determines what of the past carries forward. The relation of the present to the past is active. There's no passive reception. The present, Whitehead asserts, involves the reenaction of the immediate past, a reactivation of the aspects of it that will come back to make a difference. Through this reenaction, the present selectively takes up aspects of the past into its own singular taking form. What becomes involves repetition, transformed into novel immediacy, quoting Whitehead. The transformation in question is the active self-constitution of the moment's becoming. It's taking determinate shape. The occasion takes shape as a function of, quoting Whitehead again, its living aim toward its own self-constitution, exploiting the resources of the past toward its completion in the immediate future. It could be said with equal justice that the present is mediated by the determinations of the past, and that it is mediated by the allure of the future, because the present is precisely the self-formative middling of the two, an emergent third. This is a third that supervenes rather than intervenes. It is supplemental, adding the one of its becoming to the many that have earlier become and may still come. However, retaining the word mediation at this point is no more than a matter of habit. What comes through the middle does not intervene between two existing endpoints. It directly supervenes between two wide open-endednesses, the past and the future, filling the in-between with its own immediacy, taking shape from the middle. Mediation in the usual sense places the emphasis on a particular notion of determination. Everything hinges on the linear causality of a transition from point A to point B, and how that transmission, I keep getting, the two key words are transition and transmission, I keep getting them wrong. Everything hinges on the linear causality of a transmission from point A to point B, and how that transmission determines what comes next. The move from A to B is a closed segment, bookended by the sending of the message as initial cause, and the reception of the message as consequent effect, separated from its cause by the interval of transmission. In immediation, determination is recursive. It occurs in the fusional loop between the past and the future. The emphasis is on potential. The emphasis is on the active selection of potential by a self-constituting duration, rather than the passive entraining of an effect already prefigured in and commensurate with its cause. Quote, immediacy is the realization of the potentials of the past and is the storehouse of the potentialities of the future. Whitehead. That realization is not a commensuration, but a supplementation. The in-between is not closed by prefiguration, it is open-ended by an excess of potential, more than can actually be absorbed in the event. Immediation is the interval. It is the thickness of that self-constituting in-between. There is no separate message that is communicated across the interval. There is only the expression of potential in a taking determinate form that parses the openness with its own becoming. The expression is of a momentous self-constitution, momentaneous, I should say, in the moment. The self-constituting is both the form and content of the event of becoming. In the expression, the form and content integrally fuse into what can be called, albeit somewhat misleadingly and for lack of a better word, the dynamic form of the event. Ultimately, what is transmitted, what is carried across by the transition self-constitution is formative potential, not information. Potential is not transmitted as a content. Unlike the determining taking form that parses out of it, potential has no definitive form or content. It is transmitted as a degree of freedom of form and from content. These gloss respectively as the remainder of futurity left over across every transition, free for subsequent form-taking, and the inheritance of the past, the initial energetic charge that the occasion's self-constitution takes up and from which it departs to the extent that it becomes. The past has no given content because it is taken as content by and for the occasion's self-constitution. The future, for its part, has no taken form because it gives, in the sense that a door that opens just a crack gives when pushed. In Immediation, there is no form-content dialectic. Form and content only figure as presently fused into dynamic form or separated out as freedom of futurity and freedom from complete determination by the past. The freedom is not total but gradated of a certain degree. The degree of freedom varies for each passing present depending on the way it spins its open-endedness. Not even freedom is a general concept for immediation. Immediation, in its self-constituting of its own event, only knows the singular. The binary distinctions out of which the paradigm of immediation is constructed are reconstrued by immediation as processual distinctions bearing on aspects of the cut flow of time as qualitative change or the becoming through the middle of continuity, that is, the event. So what I'm trying to do is to create a certain displacement from notions of information to notions of expression, and to construe the event as a certain way of potential that you could say is transmitted from the past, being reactualized toward the future to constitute a present taking form. But to call it a transmission isn't really good enough, because what happens is the emergence of a relation that is not just in the event, but is the event and carries with it a certain quality of experience that makes it what I was calling a kind of ideal locus. So the displacement is from information to notions of potential, from transmission of message to expression as a bringing into existence of a new qualitative dimension or qualitative episode of life. Looked at from this point of view, the question of what forms of mediation, what apparatuses of mediation are involved become, in a way, because you're not starting from that notion of an intervening third, but from the idea of an emergent thirdness of relation. So the problems become less problems of transmission and problems of cut and continuity, because every event, as it's launching itself, is in some way potentially in touch with all of the potentials bequeathed to it that it has inherited from the past, but it selectively cuts into that plenum in order to actualize a quantum of the potential in its own form, in the form of the event. So Peirce will say that existence is rupture, but that there's a kind of over-existence, super-existence, that comes up through the middle of the rupture, which consists in re-expressing the plenum from a selective perspective. So the questions of sort of arcane philosophical questions of continuity become sort of central to this from a philosophical perspective, which seems strange because you'd be thinking when you're talking about something like a medium or mediation that you're talking about two endpoints that are discrete and separate, and that there's a trajectory between them that doesn't quite belong to either one. So a lot of what theoretically I've tried to deal with has to do with rethinking continuity as a function of the cut, rethinking the nature of the plenum. And that, of course, was a topic that was very, very dear to Peirce's heart, who saw his philosophy really as a logic of the continuum of continuity. And when he talks about mediation, he gives what would seem at first sight to be a very strange example, which is a fork in the road. So rather than starting with two endpoints, he's starting in the middle at a point of bifurcation. And then he says, what's the cut here and what's the continuity? And if you think of the continuity as being one point, you have a problem, because when it bifurcates, where does the point go? Does it go with one path, or does it go down the other path? So Peirce, in his usual imaginative way, talking logic with sometimes fairly absurd examples, he said, the point doesn't go down either one. If that happened, one segment would be totally open-ended, and it would fall back into the continuum, and you wouldn't actually have a bifurcation, that it's logically impossible. And all that has to do with problems with the notion that continuities are made of discrete points, and the very well-known paradoxes of Zeno that have haunted Western philosophy. So he has a very simple solution. He says, the point actually spontaneously duplicates itself. It becomes 2 points, and it becomes the zone of indistinction between two paths. So the continuity is creating a zone of indistinction that is the present moment, but it's already tending toward a bifurcation down two different paths where different potentials will be actualized. So the rupture of existence is the decision happening at that point, which could happen by means that are unintentional. For example, when you're lost and just take a path in the woods at random. And the rupture of existence is a kind of existential decision made in a state of heightened, intensified potential about which potentials will be brought into actualization. And he goes from there to create other concepts of the plenum, saying that if continuity were made of separable points, it wouldn't be continuity. It would simply be an endless series of sets within sets of discrete points. So then he goes back to his idea of points having a kind of irritability, almost like a protoplasm, And he says that you can't conceive of the continuity in terms of points. You have to conceive of it in terms of overlaps, that the points are moving, they're vibrating, they're moving over each other, creating virtual neighborhoods of overlap that constitute neighborhoods of potential, and it's in relation to those neighborhoods of virtual potential that an event chooses one path or another. So he makes activity, rather than a geometric point, the basis of his philosophy of continuity. And so from there you have not a foundation for a theory of immediation, but again, taking Sebastian's words, a groundless ground for immediation, where we're always anchored afloat in a point of potential that's a point of decision. And the point of going through all of that about relation and thirdness as opposed to sets of three is to say that that point of decision always involves more than can be contained in any one decision point. So if you have a number of people involved, it's literally what happens in between in the way in which their actions mutually intertwine to create an emergent effect that has to do with the relation. And that emergent effect is never controllable just from one side by the very nature of being in relation. And it's also not simply within the human elements that there's always inflections or modulations or conditionings that happen coming from non-human elements in the context. So it creates sort of a notion of immediation as a point of expression that brings into existence new or renewed qualities of experience as part of an ecology that integrally includes the humans involved, but beyond that integrates non-human elements. So in a sense, it's a little worlding. Each event is a world of immediation, and what moves through the world is a passage from one immediation to the other, rather than from a receiver to a sender, and the message is the form of existence itself, the mode of existence that's composed in that process. Okay, so I think with that I'll turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Brian. So now you'll get it again. And there's a lot of overlap, so you can daydream. Because Brian and I live in a world of immediation. And thank you. Toward a politics of immediation, 12 propositions. 1, the subject. It always happens in the middle. We always happen in the middle. Not first a thought, then an action, then a result, but a middling. We, the result of a pull that captures for an instant how the thought was already action-like, how the body was always also a world. Not first a body, then a world, but a world in which bodyings emerge. Not one, then the other, but time topologically, we, a burst too vertiginous to articulate in the one word after the other language of I. Not mediation, not something that comes in between to parse the existing terms, but immediation, the withness of time, of body in the making. For Alfred North Whitehead, there is never a subject that pre-exists an occasion of experience. And there is never a time into which we bathe fully formed. All occasions of experience fashion the quality of subjectivity their uniqueness calls forth. In so doing, they co-create the time of the event. A subject is in time, coming into itself just this way in this set of conditions, only to change again with the force of a different set of conditions. A subject can therefore never be reduced to a single occasion, as though that single iteration of experience could map onto every past and future instance of what it might have meant to have come into oneself. Such an account would leave no room for the liveliness of difference in the world. If this is the case, why is it that we maintain such a strong sense of the subject? How can we speak with such confidence about subject positions and identity practices? Why do we claim to know the subject so clearly? 2. Simple location. Whitehead would argue that the persistence of the pre-existing subject as identity position is a fallacy of simple location. Simple location refers to the notion that matter is self-contained, localized in a region with a passive, static network of spatial relations entwined in a uniform relational system. That was a quote from Whitehead. Yet matter, as Whitehead underscores, is fused into its environment. Quote, there is no possibility of a detached, self-contained local existence. The environment enters into the nature of each thing. Some elements in the nature of a complete set of agitations may remain stable as those agitations are propelled through a changing environment. But such stability is only the case in a general, average way, end quote. The pre-existing subject as agent of experience prolongs the logic Whitehead outlines above, carrying over the self-contained local existence of matter into its materialization in the body. Like matter, which in this fallacy of misplaced concreteness is set up as, quote, a self-contained static network of social relations, the pre-existing subject meets the world as a distinct, fully formed other. Any account of simple location misses the push and pull of relation, reducing the complexity of all that co-composes to the set of mediated interactions that make up this one subject-driven identity. For Whitehead, the subject is always born of the event. An occasion, that was 3, the superject. For Whitehead, the subject is always born of the event. An occasion coming into itself is oriented by a certain quality of form-taking. This is what he calls its subjective form. Subjective forms are not subjects in the strong sense. They are the subjects of the event. They are the way the event gathers its complexity into itself. Whitehead writes, an actual entity is at once the subject experiencing and the superject of its experiences, end quote. If the subject is the subjective form of the occasion coming into itself just this way, the superject is what crystallizes its quality of becoming as the event perishes. In process philosophy, an occasion of experience is fully and absolutely what it is when it comes into its superject. But the superject, as the living form force of an actual occasion, is short-lived. It must perish to give way to other experiences. This means that subjects are short-lived. What persists is the quality of form of the superject, the force of form it leaves as a trace in the world. In Whitehead's vocabulary, the superject, or the subject of experience, persists once it has perished, only as the datum for experience to come. It is not the superject as already formed that continues into experience, but its angling into expression as it conforms to occasions to come. Whitehead's account of process underscores that any process involves the cut of difference. The conditions of experience will always have changed. Quote, "The ancient doctrine that no one crosses the same river twice is extended," Whitehead writes. "No thinker thinks twice. And, to put the matter more generally, no subject experiences twice," end quote. What has agency, or preferably agencement, is the process, not the figure of the pre-existing subject. Every occasion, every event is an agencement, a singular reorienting of the conditions of experience. Through its perishing, what the occasion leaves behind is not a fully formed subject that will enter unchanged into the next occasion, but the agencement of its having come into experience or into existence just this way. It is the agencement, the conditioning of experience and its singularity now moving into new occasions that moves the world. 4. Time middling. Time is never linear in Whitehead's account. Experience is topological, bending with the force of pastnesses, future presenting. Time is topological, a fold rather than a line. Mediation presupposes the time of the line. Organizing experience from the perspective of its unwavering extremities, mediation relies on opposable presuppositions. The subject is essential here. Mediation's work is to enter into a naturalized social relation that consists of pre-existing subjects and objects. With power structures firmly in place, mediation enters into the equation not to recast experience, but to extract further structures. This restructuring may, and indeed often will, also have an effect on the terms at hand, shifting the stakes of their relation. This may even cause a certain redistribution of power, but it will not fundamentally alter the conditions of experience. Recasting experience is the work immediation does. It does so not in opposition to mediation. Immediation's logic has no relationship to mediation. Whereas mediation, by its very nature, requires time to be a container into which experience plays out, immediation makes apparent that relations are emergent. Experience is not an external quantity to be analyzed. Experience grows from the middle. It is from this middling that immediation does its work, recognizing that everything has effects. Each occasion of experience leaves traces that affect how experience reactualizes. 5. Non-sensuous perception. William James is suspicious of any account of time that would claim to know the now of experience. As in Whitehead, time for James is the time of the event, a time too complex to parse in the past, present, future account of metric time we are accustomed to. James writes, "Let anyone try. I will not say to arrest, but to notice or attend to the present moment of time. One of the most baffling experiences occurs. Where is it, this present? It has melted in our grasp, fled ere we could touch it, gone in the instant of becoming," end quote. The present, James says, is specious. Quote, "In short, the practically cognized present is no knife edge, but a saddleback with a certain breadth of its own on which we sit perched and from which we look in two directions onto time," end quote. Like James's specious present, the not-here-ness of the present felt in its passing, Whitehead's account of time aims to foreground how the future bends into the present, even as the past colors it. Time is past contouring in its future presenting. Experience knows not time itself, the present, but the burst of its presenting in a time as yet to be invented. Non-sensuous perception is the term Whitehead gives to the act of past contouring that enables a certain persistence of experience, bringing the future into the present. Every occasion of experience, Whitehead argues, pushes forth a certain quality of its continuance, even as it perishes into pastness. This quality is carried more than sensed, moving with experience as it shifts. The question is how that continuity moves into and affects the present passing, so the whole project that Brian was just discussing. Typically, the movement from past to present would be accounted for with sense perception. For Whitehead, this continuity must not be reduced to sense perception, as this would imply a cognition of time passing, a mediation of the present into the past by the figure living in the present. It would ignore the specious quality of the present. And this is, I would say, the rupture with phenomenology. 6, more than human. The preconstituted subject is inevitably connected to the human, which, like the subject, tends to be mobilized as a categorical given. Sylvia Wynter dates the category of the human as we now conceive of it to 1492. This is the date of what she calls the bifurcation of history. In this period of early colonization, the human is constructed as an epistemological category that serves, quote, to reify bourgeois tenets. Any notion of hybridity is excluded. Quote, the larger issue is, then, the incorporation of all forms of human being into a single homogenized descriptive statement that is based on the West's liberal mono-humanist man, end quote. As Wynter argues, this bifurcation of history has facilitated the exclusion of life, of black life, of neurodiverse life from its descriptive statement of indigenous life, should mention as well. With black life, that life that troubles all categories, that unmoors existence by deviating from the order that seeks to sequester it, other kinds of life have also been sequestered from the human as leading category of existence. Disabled life, life that invents new modes of living, modes of existence that create life environments that are too illegible to count, to be counted, that are too cumbersome, too excessive, too creative to make it into the category. The category of the human is more fragile than it would like to appear. In fact, it is so uncertain of the place it occupies that it requires continuous policing. The human, and humanism more generally, is terrified by the prospect that faced with the plethora of modes of practicing, of becoming praxis, as Wynter articulates it, other modes of existence might be created that trouble its position of centrality. To keep its central position as maker and taker of the world, vigilance must be practiced. And so juridical, historical, political systems are created and sustained to hold the category in place and keep that which threatens it at bay. Complex systems of subjugation must be set in place, and with them come practices of mediation, practices that stage repetitive choreographies of oppression. These practices of mediation include not only the policing of black bodies, of transgender bodies, of neurodiverse bodies, of queer and feminist and disabled bodies. They also critically include the framing of what counts as knowledge, as value. This is what we tend to forget in the context of mediation, that it has also given us the very category of knowledge itself. What is framed as knowledge is mediated always by the neurotypical. We could stop here and fight. The problem is we'd be fighting against the mediation, mediating the mediation. We'd be restaging the very same conditions that created the problem in the first place. Quote, to study man or humanity is to study a narrativization that has been produced with the very instruments or categories that we study with. Mignolo. A politics of immediation invites us to begin elsewhere. It invites us to begin not with the terms intact, but in the middling where things are still forming and categories are not yet. Cutting into the middle, moved by the force of the future in the past presenting, immediation seeks not structure, but composition. This involves improvisation. There is no knowing quite how the conditions of experience will be altered by the event of time's middling. This is not to discount the extraordinary suffering that comes of being excluded from the category of the human, nor to underplay the horror of slavery then and now, nor to excuse the exclusion perpetrated in the too often unspoken name of neurotypicality, nor to ignore the continuing violence upheld by that very category. It is to take seriously that we must come to knowledge differently, beyond the strictures of colonialism, beyond, quote, the instruments or categories that we study with. Mignolo. In this we would accompany Winter, who, in Magnolo's words, quote, seeks to undo the systems through which knowledge and knowing are constituted. 7. Decolonization. If we follow Winter in her assertion that colonization creates an exclusive figure of the human, bringing the concept of the human into a lasting relationship not only with colonialism, but with capital and its matrix of power, we might see the act of turning against the figure of the human as a decolonial gesture. This is the direction Nandita Sharma takes when she argues that the act of decolonization has to be careful not to take up the very instruments of power knowledge mobilized by the oppressor. The turn away from the category of the human as a decolonial gesture would by necessity also have to be a turning away from the conditions of identity imposed by that very colonial regime that gave the human its boundedness in the first place, she suggests. The decolonial gesture would have to be immediating, not mediating. Decolonization cannot do its work from within the confines of colonial modes of power knowledge. It must move beyond existing epistemologies, and in doing so, also move beyond those very categories that uphold the human as colonization has defined it. Foremost amongst them, identity and the nation state as defined by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. This is thorny work, given the impulse to take back what has been stolen. And so we must listen to how indigenous scholars themselves work through the issue of land rights, always aware that there are ways of encountering land that exceed and complicate the territorial imperatives of the nation-state. Land must be reclaimed in order to practice and, where necessary, to reactivate with the land modes of living that have been violently usurped by the settler colonial mode of transforming land into the territory of the state. We must reinvent, led by those who are active in the practice of decolonization, how else to encounter land as a lively aspect of more than human modes of becoming. It is from this perspective that Sharma writes of the importance of resisting imagining, quote, the space of colonization as finite, end quote. As Sharma argues, it is important to, quote, see the broader field of power that processes of colonialism opened up. Building future modes of knowing that are rich with traces of the past while active with new imaginings is at the heart of the decolonial ciencia Magnolo reads as the continuation of Winter's decolonial project. What would knowledge look like were it not framed by the mediating power of the legacy of colonial practices? 8. Modes of existence. Étienne Souriau's work on modes of existence explores the way in which constellations of tendencies coagulate to become modes of existence that alter the conditions of the world as we know it. In his recent book on Souriau, The Merest Existences, Les Existences Moindres, David Lapoujade explores Souriau's modes of existence to better understand the place of those qualities of experience which are often cast aside and overlooked, those very qualities that immediation is most engaged with. These merest of existences, as Lapoujade defines them, can be seen as intensifications of experience that alter the quality of what comes to be. They are potentialities, tonalities, tendencies, virtualities. On the continuum of force-form that makes up modes of existence, they are on the side of force, not form. And yet, as Lapoujade argues through a close reading of Souriau's work, these merest of existences make all the difference. Modes of existence could be conceived as styles. A mode of existence, quote, is a manner of making a being exist on a given plane, Lapoujade. A mode is a gesture, a way of orienting toward, quote, each existence consists of a gesture that it instaurates, end quote. Instauration understood as the act imminent to the event of bringing a mode into existence. The plane of existence is replete with such gestures that qualify existence, that give it its style in the event time of its activation. These gestures are not those of a preconstituted subject. Quote, they are imminent to existence itself, Lapoujade. A gesture, a style, makes a subject, not the other way around. The gestures of existence, the modes, do not necessarily reveal themselves as such. Quote, the majority of these modes remain at the level of sketches or drafts. They are not capable of differentiating themselves from the indistinct base into which they re-immerse themselves. Lapoujade. The question is whether that which does not take form, that does not take effect as such, can nonetheless make a difference. Do these sketches and drafts affect experience? Does the force of form alter the quality of what ultimately comes to be known? This is a key question for a politics of immediation. Mediation, as suggested above, relies on pre-existing categories which it then mediates. A reorganizing of experience can occur through mediation, but it will always, by definition, have kept the terms of the exchange intact. This procedure relies on the primacy of the already constituted. It relies on a kind of knowing that presumes that what makes the difference has already come to form and can be known as such. Immediation functions radically differently. It makes no a priori assumptions about what can make a difference, nor does it map a space of interaction that moves between two existing limit points, setting itself as the arbiter of that exchange. Immediation middles, which is to say that it crafts middlings from which it tends to experience still in germ. Immediation is how the germinating through which force and form is the how of the germinating through which force and form co-compose. Under these conditions, everything makes a difference, even those gestures which sketch only the merest of influences. 9. The witness and the advocate. Souriau has two conceptual persona, the witness and the advocate. These conceptual persona are the motivators of his system. They are what move the modes into intensification. The witness and the advocate could be seen as the barometers of the process of moving toward the actualization of a mode of existence. As Lapujade underscores, these are not existing subjects that stand outside the event. They are the motor that creates the conditions for the mode of existence to take form. The witness carries the gesture of the act of seeing, faire voir. The advocate, always in relation to the witness, moves the seeing into full-fledged appearance. The advocate embodies the gesture of advocacy for existences in germ, as fledglingly perceived by the witness, bringing them onto the plane of experience. For Souriau, the artist is perhaps the best figure of the advocate. Artists, quote, bring new entities into existence, produce new realities, end quote. Lapujade. But we might ask, what are the conventions of the witness's act of seeing and the advocate's actualization of that seeing? What remains unseen in the act of witnessing, even when witnessing is imminent to the event? Can the advocate escape the category of judgment that is carried by its double meaning as advocate and lawyer? Is the making perceptible of experience by the witness advocate not a mediation of experience? Must all comings into itself of modes of existence pass through such conceptual figures? What of the force of artfulness itself, that force that alters the condition of existence without passing through mediators? 10. The will to art. Lapujade writes of, quote, the cloud of virtualities, la nuée des virtuels, that populates experience. The cloud of virtualities accompanies all comings to be, but is never known as such. Its power is precisely that it remains unachieved. Modes of existence are rendered more complex through the ingression of what remains unachieved. Quote, the cloud of virtualities awaits the art that can make them exist more and otherwise. Its art is to generate or to demand art. Their own gesture is to create other gestures, end quote, Lapujade. When Souriau speaks of art here, he is moving beyond the human figure of the artist toward what I have elsewhere called artfulness, the aesthetic yield of experience in the making. This faire oeuvre, the working of the work, is not about a finished object prepared by a pre-existing subject. It is about the way, about the how of coming to experience differently. Art does this best when it takes the shape of a problem that does not yet carry its solution, when it composes transversally with differentials of existence. These are the conditions wherein a, quote, desire for creation is introduced, quote, a will to art in the world, une volonté d'art dans le monde, Lapujade. Minor gestures populate this will to art, the will to art, a kind of Nietzschean will to power that yields aesthetically. Activating a Guattarian ethico-aesthetic paradigm, the will to art sees the aesthetic yield as the creative force of the in-act that does not discount what remains cloudy. The merest of existences are valued here. Quote, all existence becomes entitled to be unachieved, writes Lapujade, following Souriau. All existence can modify itself, transform itself, intensify its reality, move from one mode to another, conjugate them, Lapujade. If virtualities bring the force of the problem to the art of life living, minor gestures are the propulsion that play out the problem virtualities bring to existence. Minor gestures, as I have defined them elsewhere, are the force of deviation that activate variation in experience, not propelled by an existing subject, not ours to make. Minor gestures attune experience to what is variable within it, orienting to its artfulness. In this regard, minor gestures are very much attuned to the merest of existences and to the incipient modes, virtual operations. Minor gestures are the transversal operations that intensify experience, activating the surplus, the more than, through which experience touches its aesthetic yield. With the motor of the minor gesture and its capacity to tune the occasion, it seems to me that the conceptual persona of the witness and the advocate are no longer necessary. Personifications of experience, even when imminent to the event, risk returning us to the human as central category. In the process of the rock's perception of experience, in its prehension of time, as Whitehead loves to say, why bring in a witness and an advocate? Why not work from within rockness itself, from within the force of imminent variation at the heart of this singular mode of existence? Why not ask directly how minor gestures alter the conditions of rockness? Why not consider the artful quality of this becoming from the perspective of its own process, exploring the will to art on its immediating terms? An approach that begins with the problem, that takes seriously Bergson's call that we not seek problems that already have solutions, false problems, but work instead from the field of experience's most knotted sites to discover not the answer, but the conditions of existence of that very knottedness, requires modes of engagement that resist mediation at all costs. With the allure of mediation as strong as it remains, why take the risk of re-mediating the occasion through figures that would risk imposing value systems on the burgeoning event? Why risk making all existence an existence mediated by the human, even in the form of conceptual persona? Instead of taking the juridical model of the advocate into the realm of the artful, why not take artfulness into politics, making decolonization and the more than human the sites of encounter with aesthetic yield? Staying close to Souriau's work while moving away from the figures of the witness and the advocate in favor of the minor gesture, the question remains, how does the transduction happen? What motivates the shift from an incipiency to a mode of existence? What makes existences take shape? If the human is not where activity begins and ends, if there is no subject orienting experience from the outset, what makes the difference such that difference is felt? Instauration is the concept Souriau gives to the shift that activates the dephasing through which a mode of existence comes into being. An instauration is always a subtraction. Instauration culls from the wealth of the gesture only this detail, this singular set of relations, and brings it to the fore. This gathering into itself has effects. What has come to be by subtracting from the welter of potential now orients the mode of existence it has come to embody. This, in turn, affects the coming into itself through non-sensuous perception of what will follow. Tendencies affirm similar tendencies, habits are formed, and soon we have an object, an instituted way, a being in the world. Working from within the event, the minor gesture is not an advocate. The work it does is far more constitutive to the event. It is not mediating, but immediating. The minor gesture operates, pulling the event into an intensification that makes palpable the unknowing at its heart, keeping the problem of the event alive. The minor gesture moves the will to art into an event, into the event. It does so by keeping the force of the problem alive, composing with its singular constellation of relations. This is not to say that all of this occurs harmoniously. Minor gestures are no more harmonious or good than are any other gestures or modes of existence. How they come to be depends on the problems they take up. The same can be said for instauration. The intensification of experience is not necessarily positive. It is vital not to invest in mediation with morality. How things come to be is always determined by the conditions that open the way for their singular mode of existence. This is why there can be no general politics of the minor, and certainly no general politics of immediation. The aesthetic yield always depends on a way, and it is the way that must be studied each time. This is the ethics of this approach. Last one, 12, Hexaides. A politics of immediation makes a case for an attunement to the most minute of variations. Our more than humanness is rife with such variations, most of which we regularly ignore in favor of the consolidation of experience from which we say I. And sometimes that is the only way. Consolidation does remain necessary in a world that tends to decry complexity and variation. But the variation is there, and this variation, in all of its nebulousness, far exceeds anything we might call the human as carrier of hierarchies of existence. We were always more than human. The human as category was never really capable of describing us, of including us. It was there as descriptive statement to tell us what we aren't. For those who fit nearly within its bounds have never needed to be included. They already speak from its center. And yet, these orators of human-centeredness, these humanists for whom the world is a site to be governed, these neurotypicals who already know what it means to know, they are more than human too. There is no human. Only, as Winter might say, descriptive statements that keep epistemologies of segregation, violence, and exclusion alive. In the work of attuning to the more than that composes us and the more than that eludes us, the most difficult concept remains that of relation itself. How to speak of what animates our coming into being but is not us. How to speak of modes that are not ours. How to write from the middling of experience in a way that situates us as participants and not leaders of the action. How to not give in and create witnesses and advocates that mediate the value of experience. How to speak of that which absolutely isn't us, but nonetheless affects the we are becoming. How to write of modes of existence that are so other that they don't even register. Or if they register, do so such that they leave us searching for ways to account for their radical difference without reclaiming them as our own. A politics of immediation begins here, in the not knowing. For in the middling, there is never a knowing in advance. What there are hexaides, qualities that are yet to come into full presence, but nonetheless already make the merest of differences. These hexaides of existence carry with them a thisness, an orienting, but no form as such. They are the atmosphere that permeates the associated milieu of existence in forming. They are the stuff of relation. They are the relational tenor of incipiencies that may never come to form, but will nonetheless always have been felt, if not by us, then by the world. Atmosphere is a relationscape that refuses mediation. It may include us, but it also always exceeds us. Its feltness a contributory factor in experience that affects us without being only about us. Always more than what it actualizes, atmosphere is carried by that which comes into being, but is not limited to it. It affects and is affected, qualifying experience. It has no form, only force. And yet all takings form are affected by it. A pure relation, it never operates alone. Atmosphere could perhaps be said to be that which creates the conditions for all that is relational, that which carries the potential for all which comes into contact. Brian Massumi connects atmosphere to affective tonality, suggesting that affective tonality is, quote, the leading edge of experience. Atmosphere, he writes, is the background of that leading edge, a diffuse vitality affect. Every instauration brings with it an atmosphere. This atmosphere is the tone, the color of that intensification. A politics of immediation requires an attunement to those hexaides that condition experience without foregrounding themselves as events in their own right. How to attune to the force of a collectivity, to the quality of a mutual envelopment, in Brian Massumi's words, that is atmosphere. How to speak of the condition of the felt differential that is atmosphere. How to encounter its nebulousness without attempting to make it our own, to make it something. How to compose with the how of coming to act in a way that allows for modes of becoming that exceed the form of being, encouraging an artfulness that is sensitive to the aesthetic yield of the event. This requires new gestures, new postures, new in the sense of emergent to the event, activated from the event's middling. And it requires new modes of narration, new modes of writing. Following Saidiya Hartman, we must learn to, quote, write history differently, challenging the mediating models that are used to mobilize and strengthen existing forms of valuation that tend to privilege those modes already in existence, modes too often seeped in the epistemologies of colonialism, in the identity practices colonialism breeds. This is not an easy task, especially when dealing with the unspeakable violences of colonialism. This work of crafting new modes of existence will never be possible if we situate ourselves in the position of the critic, observing the world from the sidelines, as Hartman also underlines. Only immanent critique can do the work of immediation, critique that moves from the force of the inact to discover not only what the conditions of a singular mode of existence are, but what its complex hexaides reveal. Critique that stands in as judge and mediator of experience will only ever leave things firmly in place. Immediation is a practice. It is an act, a verb. Relational to the core, it reminds us that time is never a point and that experience can never be reduced to that which is culled from the welter. Experience is atmosphere coupled with the cut of subtraction. Here, where we look into two directions into time, it is the more than that defines us. A politics of immediation proposes this schiz of experience informing as the site of existence's potential. Reprise, beyond identity. A passage from Fred Moten has haunted the writing of these words. In a parenthetical aside in a paper on the city and the commune, Fred Moten cautions us as regards the critique of identity politics. Too often, he writes, critiques of identity politics are waged, quote, against non-white, non-straight, non-male identity, while courteously, how do you say that? Courteously? To be courteously. Okay, good. I'll start that again. Every once in a while you can tell that French is my mother tongue. Too often, he writes, critiques of identity politics are waged against, quote, non-white, non-straight, non-male identity, while courteously leaving politics to its own uncriticized devices, end quote. How to raise the problem of identity positions in a way that doesn't perform this kind of gesture. How to problematize identity while remaining sensitive to the fact that for some, the loss of a sense of identity may feel like the very same gesture as the colonial act of exclusion from the category of the human. How not to engage in re-disenfranchising those very bodies that have historically been denied subjectivity. How to create an affirmative politics of emergent subjectivity that does not ignore that allegiances are necessary in the face of the systemic violence of oppression. The task, it seems to me, involves recasting allegiance such that it need no longer be subsumed to identity, and by extension to the individual. For the individual, that pet figure of neoliberalism, is nothing more than the other side of the subject, which is the other side of the human. To focus on the individual in an exploration of modes of existence, to make the politics about the individual, is to reinstall a mediation that knows in advance how to recognize the human as orienter of experience. The problem of identity must instead be engaged from the perspective of Winter's descriptive statement of the human. This category of the human, as Winter underscores, is concerned to perpetuate a genre of the human. What kinds of sociality cut across this genre? A critique of identity politics must always be an engagement with what else it can mean to be human as praxis. It must come from the unsettledness of giving up on the genre of the human too many of us take for granted. A critique of identity politics must coincide with the creation of new modes of existence that privilege not our pre-constituted position, but engage deeply with the will to art that opens the world to new minor gestures. A critique of identity politics can therefore never be spoken in our name, nor can it risk the figure of the mediator or the advocate. Beginning in the middle, working from a politics of immediation, a critique of identity politics must learn to compose with the hexaides that exceed us, with the subtractions that make us. Finally, following Moten, we must not, quote, leave politics to its own uncriticized devices. Just as we must not situate politics in the realm of those very categories that exclude us, the we are becoming. A politics of immediation orients around a thinking of the political that itself must be invented anew with each occasion of experience. With this call for invention comes an urgency to be vigilant about the category of the human, to think differently about where we begin and end, and to create movements of thought, modes of knowing, that depart from a place that is infested with the legacy of colonialism and the barren imagination it leaves behind. Turning instead to the aesthetic yield of experience in the making, what if we began with the hexaides that blur our contours, seeing these new ecologies not as less than the subjects we are accustomed to being, but as infinitely more than? Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigado ao Brian e a Erin pela essa brilhante conferência, e que certamente traz um conjunto de informações. Eu estou aqui pensando as coisas, né? Ainda não consigo entrar nessa lógica do agradecimento e seguir coordenando a mesa. Que nós possamos conversar com eles a respeito das ideias que foram aqui apresentadas e dos interesses que vocês têm. Nós temos bastante tempo, até meio-dia, para as conversas. E aí o até meio-dia mesmo, que a gente tem que sair do espaço, por regras do próprio espaço. É público, mas não é eterno. A gente tem que utilizar e respeitar o horário do trabalho das pessoas, né? Alguém quer começar a conversa?
Bom dia, eu me chamo Davi. Primeiro eu gostaria de agradecer as falas dos dois professores, e a minha pergunta vai mais diretamente ao Brian, né? E Desculpe a minha pouca compreensão nos estudos do Peirce, mas eu queria a sua ajuda para tentar entender um pouco mais e melhor as colocações e conceitos que você trouxe aqui, né? Me parece que a experiência se dá em cada idade, né, das idades do Peirce, e seria na primeira idade que a experiência se faz fruto desse contato imediato. Eu queria guardar aí essa noção de imediato, né? Então, no contato com essa coisa, ou com esse signo, como você chamou de o fato em si, né? Então, minhas perguntas seriam mais ou menos assim. Como é que você apresentou a terceira idade como sendo esse lugar da imediação? E eu queria saber qual é a relação, então, desse imediato da primeira idade com as imediações da terceira idade, né? Para eu tentar entender um pouco melhor se existe ou não existe uma relação entre o imediato e a imediação, né? E uma outra coisa que eu queria saber é como lidar, então, com a interpretação ou a percepção, que seriam as mediações do campo mais da terceira idade, né? E se essas mediações, a interpretação e a percepção, elas contaminam a equação da terceira idade, se ela habita a noção de mediação e a sua experiência de mediação, as noções de percepção ou de interpretação. Então, é mais para eu tentar entender um pouco melhor o que seria a noção de imediação, para ficar um pouco mais claro para mim como, inclusive, operar via a imediação. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. It's a very good question. I think in the part of this paper that I read, the distinction between immediacy and immediation wasn't drawn carefully enough. There is a distinction, and I think it's important not to collapse immediation into immediacy, and the three categories of Peirce are very useful for that. The way I understand Peirce's categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness is that they're not ages or phases, but they're aspects of every event. So they always come together. You can't actually separate them out. But that doesn't mean that they're not distinct. So firstness, which I've dealt with a lot in other essays, is a pure immediacy of experience. But the problem is that firstness is very fleeting, because it's the quality, he says, such as it is all of itself, only in itself. It's a kind of absoluteness of the quality of an experience, like a color. But he also talks about how firstness is liminal. It's like at the limit of experience. So that it's only people who are on the edge of sleep, or perhaps on the edge of madness, who have an experience of firstness, because it's not our experience, it's experience in the world, of the world, that we can appropriate into our perceptions. So a firstness, a quality of firstness is fleeting by nature. It's a kind of infra-existence rather than an existence. And then I was talking about where he says that existence is rupture, and that's the dimension or the aspect of secondness, where there's a reaction or an action between two things. But there he says it's important not to divide that into an actor and into a passive recipient, that secondness is actually neither active nor reactive, but how activity and reactivity fuse into each other. So it's really, secondness is already a concept of the middle. And for him, it's the beginning of the actual world. He says that out of that secondness comes determination. There's some kind of simultaneous contrast of differently active sides of the same event that that define something. So he talks about it as the ovum of the universe, suddenly segmented. But thirdness is, if firstness for me is a kind of infra-existence, thirdness is a kind of sur or super-existence. And again, they all come immediately together as a bundle. And the thirdness is much like what Erin was talking about at the end of her talk, as that quality of experience that's enveloping and that offers potentials. And for it all to work for me, you have to, so all of the secondnesses that create contrasts and determinations are taken up into a thirdness of relation, which is the different ways that they can interact with each other. But you have to, for me, think of that there has to logically be a firstness of thirdness, where the relationality comes back up through the immediacy of the quality of firstness. And I think that coming back up through firstness is the hexaity, it's the atmosphere. So I think they only work if you put them together, and oddly, what you're always missing or was falling out, the one that is subtracted, is the actual form of being. Existence doesn't have an actual form. It's the rupture of secondness. It's the feeding back of thirdness into firstness. It's distributed across those dimensions. So existence's rupture is the determination, but it's the determination of an event, not of a thing. So I think that's the way I try to work those sort of Peircean categories together. So.
Quem é a próxima? Ou próximo?
Sou Fernando. Na verdade, eu tenho várias perguntas, mas eu não vou fazer todas elas. Eu vou fazer só 3. E vocês podem escolher uma, ou nenhuma, ou todas para responder. A primeira pergunta é: como vocês veem essa proposta da política da imediação no contexto do que o Guattari vai chamar do novo paradigma ético-estético, no contexto das 3 ecologias, né? Que relação vocês veem, se vocês veem essa relação direta ou não com a proposta do Guattari? A minha segunda pergunta, tem muito a ver com a minha alegria em ver o Whitehead tão figurado na fala de vocês. Quais são as relações que vocês veem, digamos assim, de certa forma até bibliográfica, entre Whitehead e Deleuze e Guattari, ainda mais considerando a maneira como Whitehead vai aparecendo ao longo da obra, né, às vezes mais implícito, às vezes mais explícito. E a minha terceira pergunta tem a ver com um conceito de Whitehead que vocês costearam, digamos assim, mas não surgiu tão claramente, que é o conceito de organismo. Então, de que maneira o conceito de organismo funciona dentro dessa proposta de vocês? Seria isso.
No. Okay. Well, I think it's for both of us, but well, you're obviously psychic because all we ever talk about are the 3 ecologies. In fact, we're here in Brazil, the Sense Lab is here in Brazil to talk about creating what we're calling the 3 Ecologies Institute. So, yes, absolutely, there's an enormous link for us between immediation and the 3 ecologies. And in fact, the reason Brian and I decided to speak about immediation this morning is because all of the people who came with us from different parts of the world, from Brazil, from Canada, from Australia, from Europe, are all thinking about this concept as well. So even though Brian and I stood here and talked, all of those people sitting there also have been thinking about this in relation to specifically how we can invent new ways of learning, new ways of knowing, new ways of living across those three ecologies, so the conceptual, the environmental, and the social. And that's really our project all the time. And we can speak in much more length about how we imagine that and so on. We'll actually be speaking in Sao Paulo at Casa Líquida on the 3rd of December. So no, on the 1st, I think. And so we can talk about that more. So the first question was Guattari. The second question was no, the organism was the third question. But what was the second question? Whitehead and Deleuze, yeah. I mean, we fabulate all kinds of relations between them. In fact, we believe that Deleuze barely went to sleep every night without thinking about Deleuze. I mean, Whitehead. I mean, Brian, I've asked this to Brian many times. He had the relationship with Deleuze, and what we think is that it was his wife, Fanny, who was the person who spoke English, who introduced him to a lot of the Anglophone texts, and there was that one translation of Whitehead by Jean Val, a book about it that he read. It's clear to us that the thinking of Whitehead is everywhere in his thinking. It's most obvious in Le Pli, where he works with prehension. My own experience, and I'll let Brian speak about it, is that in the context of artistic practice, which is the environment in which I teach a lot, because I'm both a philosopher and an artist, Whitehead is a much more intuitive place to begin than Deleuze. So I don't usually teach Deleuze, or if I teach Deleuze, I wait a long time. We begin with Whitehead and begin to get a sense of process and process philosophy before we go to Deleuze. And the reason I do that is because a lot of people read Deleuze, and Deleuze and Guattari especially, metaphorically. And I want to resist that metaphorical reading, and you can't read Whitehead metaphorically. I mean, it doesn't work. So for me, the whole thinking of organism, the philosophy of organism of Whitehead, is a modality for thinking the more than human always. Because as Whitehead says, a body is a society of molecules. There's no organization of the body as a categorized set of conditions. It's an emergent set of conditions. And so I think the philosophy of organism of Whitehead gives us a real opportunity to think concepts like the body without organs as they come up. But if you begin with the body without organs with artists, the danger I find is that there would be a kind of mapping of the concept into an artistic practice, which is undermines the complexity of our artistic practice. So I try really hard with the context of artistic practice to see what concepts are emerging within the artistic practice and how they can connect to questions of process. And that's where we come through Whitehead.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start at the end. With organism, I mean, it's not a term that either of us have taken up in our own work, and I think that that's due to interference, constructive interference from Deleuze and Guattari, because the term that maybe takes the place of organism for us coming out of Deleuze and Guattari is the agencement, the assemblage. And the term organism can maybe lead to some misunderstandings because it, in the context of a philosophy of self-constitution, it sounds like autopoiesis. It sounds like a closed organismic structure. It's nothing like that in Whitehead. It's constitutively open, and it's an open whole that's continually reconstituting itself by very particular uptakes, prehensions of potential, and that the particularity of the uptakes, I think, inscribes the concept in something close to an agencement with that notion of a distributed agency that can't be attributed to one part or another, but has to do with the way the parts are dynamically coming together. For the three ecologies, the three ecologies and chiasmosis has been very much at the center of our thinking as collectively at the Sense Lab for many years. In the three ecologies, toward the end, Guattari sort of invokes finitude and talks about living our finitude otherwise. And he makes it clear that when he's talking about expression as a kind of bringing into existence, a mise à l'existence, he says, that there's in some ways an exhaustion of process that happens at that point, that there's a taking on of determination that finishes itself, so that it is a question of determination and of the finitude, but it's the finitude of an event that reopens the world to potential otherwise for reuptake by other occasions. So it's not an existential wringing of his hands about death. It's actually saying that for process to continue, taking's form have to happen, and in Whitehead's term, that involves a perishing, but that's part and parcel of the process. And that it's important to understand that against the background of this continuum of potential that's reconstituted at each moment. And that takes us to the idea that Erin mentioned of composition, and how every event is a composition of the senses, and it's a composition of different potentials that belong differentially to what we would separate out as different kinds of entities or levels. But the bringing into composition yields something that exceeds the sum of the parts, and that exceeding of the sum of the parts is always expressed qualitatively in a new quality associated with a new or changed mode of existence. So that process of composition is aesthetic. So if you're talking about how we can live together, act together differently, collectively, those qualities of collective action are a very important thing to be attuned to and to act upon, which makes the aesthetic dimension completely integral to the political dimension.
O meu nome é Lucas e, na verdade, a minha pergunta é para a Erin, mas é pedindo para talvez ela falar um pouco mais de alguma coisa que ela já começou agora quando ela respondeu a pergunta dele, que é sobretudo para falar sobre isso do mediar o mediado, e você já adiantou um pouco de pensar o conceito deleuziano metaforicamente quando você vai ensinar, e me parece que agora na sua fala tem uma atenção muito grande para pensar isso e para a gente conseguir pensar isso junto, talvez. Porque quando a gente vai fazer arte, sobretudo, parece que a gente, quando ouve um conceito deleuziano, a gente tem que atender a esse conceito, e esse conceito existe quase como um norte, no lugar onde a gente deve, talvez pela arte, pensar isso e como levar isso para o mundo na arte. Isso acaba sendo um problema, quando a gente pensa por uma margem que é o Brasil, ou que a gente escreve em português também, e aí vem toda uma questão colonial e que o Deleuze acaba se embolando aí. E me parece que na sua fala tem uma tensão a esse lugar também. E agora, no que você respondeu, me parece que tem uma tensão mesmo. Então, se você pudesse falar um pouco sobre, porque é sempre uma dificuldade de tentar escrever ou tentar pensar e como agir e como trabalhar junto desses conceitos, mas de uma outra maneira, assim, que eu acho que é uma questão que a gente pode levantar e que é muito cara, assim, pelo menos para o que eu tento pensar e que eu acho que pode ser para outras pessoas também.
Is this the one that works? Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you. I hope I understood the question correctly. The first part was on the question of the mediation, and the second part was on the question of artistic practices and how they engage that way and from different locations. Is that right? More or less? More or less. The challenge I'm trying to address is complex because we're very, very familiar with the figure of mediation. All of our educational institutions are built on the concept of mediation. The idea that I give you information and you take the information and you move the information into the next environment. And this doesn't exclude our artistic practices in the institution, right? So in an institutional context, you will be organized to operate according to mediated categories of knowledge. Already the separating of artistic practice into disciplines is a mediation, right? So a mediation that would separate painting from drawing, or that would separate sculpture from performance or whatever. And so most of the time we've been, at least in my experience, I can't speak for Brazil, so I'll just speak for Canada, but in most of the time when we've been through an educational system, we've become so familiar with structures of mediation that we don't question them anymore. And so we respond to mediation with more mediation, in the sense that we can have discussions about power. This happens all the time in the university, for example, or and here I'm including art, because for us the art school is in the university, so it depends on where, for example, I'll see a practice of resistance through an artistic practice or a written practice that will be resisting the oppression of the institution, for example, which is super, super important, and I'm not denying that that's important. The question I'm asking is, are those practices responding by using the very same tools as the tools that are already operating in the institution? The problem, as you can imagine, as we all know, is that if you use different tools, your resistance may not be recognized. So there's a question of how we create a kind of collective thinking around new ways of recognizing resistance. And you can see this just as an artistic example. If anybody has been, going to the big biennales, or you go to Venice, or you go to, I can't speak for the Sao Paulo Biennale, I wasn't there, but I have shown my own work in 2 biennales, and that the biennales are often also structured according to sort of normative ideas of resistance. And of course, you always have artwork that doesn't follow that invents other ways of resisting. But for example, when I was in Russia, it was really clear that the forms of resistance were not intelligible across cultures. So that the Russians felt that a lot of our work, mine included, was not political. So there's also this problem of how do you articulate the questions in a way that resonate with different people. What I'm trying to underscore is that every one of those processes does more than mediate. It carries these germs of immediation, which is to say that it troubles the categories already. And if we became sensitive to the ways in which this troubling occurs, if we could, for example, as teachers, teach to there, if we could approach an artistic practice not from the perspective of how it already fits into a canon of practices and is already recognizable in terms of certain norms of insertion into culture, into counterculture, into resistance, if we could listen to how it's shaking that territory and develop ways of seeing and acting and making and talking and writing that connected to that. And of course this is happening. I'm not saying it's not happening. then we might be able to follow different pathways. And my feeling is that until we follow those different pathways, or if we don't attend to that, we retain a predominantly humanist engagement with the practices where the artist, the intellectual, remain the center, and the work remains the object. And that's, for me, completely counter to any practice of decolonization. Does that make sense, more or less? Did you want to?
Yeah, I think I want to... I would like to suggest that mediation never actually functions the way it says it does, that it's a kind of optical illusion or sleight of hand. If you think of mediation in ideological terms, it's the idea that orderings from the past underlie a situation and set certain parameters for it or set tendencies in place within it. And that those orderings are thought of as a structure that are in some way totalized from the past and totally underlie the situation. I don't believe things ever actually function that way, because I think that level of abstraction, it's an abstraction from events, and that totality is never an effective totality. It's too general a kind of idea or abstraction to actually function, because in any given situation, the tendencies or orderings or schema from the past, they have to enter the situation. In Whitehead's terms, they have to make ingression. They have to be activated or reactivated in order to set in motion the tendencies that they contain. That reactivation process is singular to the situation, and a lot of things have to be in place for it to take place, which means that the take on what seems to be a total structure is always partial. That means that there are some degrees of freedom in every situation over and above the pre-orderings, that there's always a possibility for a deviation or a spontaneity or a catalyzing that moves tendencies in a different direction or introduces new tendencies. So the concept that Erin was talking about at the end of the minor gesture is the idea that a small shift can actually modulate what makes ingression and perhaps open gaps that allow for other tendencies to be felt, other attractors, other qualities of existence and modes of relation. So for me, that's really important for a number of reasons. One is that it gives us what Deleuze calls belief in the world, belief that the world is offering us up potential, even in the moments where we seem to be the most contained by ideological mechanisms taking hold of our lives. And the other is that the modulating, the inflecting of situations only happens relationally, that a minor gesture might pass through an individual's body, but it's actually taking effect in the relational space, affecting all the bodies involved at the same time. So it, rather than being ideologically formed into our individual boxes and occupying the ideological positions given us, we're inhabiting together events of relation where our gestures can exceed those positionings. And it's a question of attunement to each other and to the environment and the affordances in the environment and the potentials that can come through that becomes political. So the political becomes completely wrapped up with the event, and the event is completely relational, so that it's directly, immediately political. Okay, but should I answer the second question or go on to the question about concepts and Deleuze, or should we go on to the next one? Yeah.
Bom dia, meu nome é Suzane. Bom dia, meu nome é Suzane. Eu não sou daqui da Unicamp, eu sou da Universidade Federal do Espírito Santo. E eu fico muito contente com a fala de vocês, porque nós vivemos tempos muito difíceis e eu acho que as questões que vocês trazem hoje talvez venham como um acalento também, né, de pensar essas outras possibilidades, né, de pensar fora das caixinhas, né, como o professor colocou. E aí, assim, eu fico muito contente, porque acho que a ideia de vir para o Conexões é um pouco essa também, né, de deslocar o pensamento, de movimentar o pensamento. E a minha pergunta é sobre essa questão dos pequenos, a ideia dos pequenos gestos que vocês trazem, né? Eu tenho tentado pensar agora no doutorado sobre a ideia do riso nos processos de aprendizagem. E aí eu queria que vocês falassem um pouco mais dessa ideia dos pequenos gestos, né, que nos ajudassem a pensar nessa possibilidade. Obrigada.
Uma pergunta bem breve, a propósito de algo que a Erin disse, sobre a necessidade de novos modos de escrita. Tem um poeta contemporâneo brasileiro, chamado Ismar Tirelli Neto, que escreveu um ensaio recente sobre a relação entre poesia e catástrofe, e aí eu vou citar uma frase dele. Ele diz assim: qualquer coisa precisa estar quebrada, rompida, nos poemas que escrevemos, para que eles estejam em relação com o mundo. Supondo que essa quebra, essa ruptura de que ele fala, faça apelo à imediação, como forma de relação com o mundo, o que seria, em termos de exemplos ou características, uma escrita da imediação, em particular na filosofia?
So thank you. They're both beautiful questions, and I'm sure Brian has something to say as well. I'll begin with the minor gesture. I think that minor gestures are ours to invent. I mean, not in the sense of our making them, but our becoming attuned to them. So when I wrote the book, The Minor Gesture, it wasn't in any way that I thought I had figured out what a minor gesture was or have some kind of intuitive sense of knowing them. What happened was actually, as I write in the book, that I had an exhibition of a work that I felt didn't work. And it was an exhibition where the curator was very happy with my work. But the work felt dead to me. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the confusion about what I learned from the art world in relation to what might be considered good work and what felt like work. And the interesting thing was that I was showing my work beside another artist with whom I had shown before, and I felt that his work was dead too. So I started thinking about how an environment creates the conditions for modalities of experience. And really the minor gesture came from there. And I realized that an artistic process was always a collaborative process with the world, in ways that are much more complex than any artist could ever understand. And that perhaps what moves us to make art is to be in relation to that complexity, to touch the edges of it. And sometimes we show work. The work is important to be shown because it marks a shift in the process. But actually the shown work, the objects we show, they're passages. And if we can see them as passages, some of them will connect and resonate more than others. Some of them will do their work better than others. It perhaps allows us to understand something about process. In particular, in my case, also something about ritual. So what does the world of art making and art thinking allow in terms of repetition, in terms of sorcery, in terms of the more than? So for me, it's clear that there's a relationship between laughter and minor gestures. And I think that I think of one example in particular. I'm a dancer as well, and there are moments that I live that are improvisatory moments. So like all improvisers, I look for the magic of improvisation. And if an improviser is honest with you, they'll tell you most movement is not improvised. It doesn't happen very often, actually, that improvisation really happens. But when it happens, almost always, people laugh. And I think that this laughter is a kind of shock that the world happened, that we weren't in control, and that something shifted. And so it could be really interesting to think about those forms of laughter that take us, that surprise us, that move us. And that might lead into the question of the writing. And I think it's a question that I need to ask because we need to keep asking it. And I don't think the answer to that question for me is that the writing has to take a different form. So I don't think it's that we all need to write poetry or that we all need to write literature or that we all need to stop writing academic essays. But I do think it means that we need to listen to how the writing moves us and to be less in a position of convincing than in a position of living in the writing. And in my sense, that also means thinking of writing beyond the written word and thinking about other ways in which the modality of knowing comes to expression. So one of the ways in which I think about it is to try to become sensitive to the form in which the work needs to reveal itself. And in my case, because I'm an artist, I'm always trying to understand whether the question, whether the problem requires words or it requires something else. And I think the hardest thing about what I'm saying is that it only really works in the academic world if you're already well-positioned. So if you're well-positioned academically, you can experiment. But if you're not well-positioned and you don't have prestige, you often can't experiment because the conditions of the publishing world make it impossible for you to experiment. And so one of the things I think is that those of us who are positioned might take the time to be on those boards that allow other kinds of writing to shift and move in, that we might be in those positions of creating spaces for younger authors to be able to write differently, especially perhaps outside of the model, like I said, of convincing or of oversighting. The practices of citation, which are often territorial practices, the practices to show that you're intelligent enough, that you've crossed enough bridges, that you've read enough things. I think we could create conditions where this kind of policing would be less necessary and there could be more space to think together. But I think there needs to be a revolution for that to happen. And I'm saying all of this with an enormous amount of uncertainty because I'm not at all sure the university is a place where we can think anymore.
One of the things Erin said, in addition to the final question mark on the university and the modes of knowledge, is that while we're inhabiting the university, and there are good reasons strategically and personally to do that, we don't have to stop writing academic essays, but I think we have to start thinking about writing them differently. And too often the form that's imposed on academic writing foregrounds the sort of the signifying content and the content in logical propositions. But Erin also said that there are other modes of knowing in the world, and I think there are ways of integrating relays to those in the writing. So Deleuze, when he's talking about Foucault, he keeps repeating this phrase that you have to crack words open. And by that he means you have to give them a force beyond the signifying content and beyond the content in terms of logical propositions, that the words have to be scintillating with other modes of knowing so that the same concept as an operator could be actualized in dance or in visual art, so that there's a kind of built-in relay to other modes within the writing. And it reminded me of a part of this example of the fork in the road that Peirce talks about that I didn't get to, where I was talking about how he talks about the end point reduplicating into a zone of indistinction, but reduplicating is just a weak word for it, because he actually says it bursts forth into a multitude of potential paths that are virtual but are in some way felt in the event. And it reminded me of this idea of Deleuze and Guattari's of event particles, how the world is irritable in this way that it's wanting to express more than it can express at every moment, and it's bursting into this multiplicity of paths. And I think writing can include those paths that can only be followed in other modes, so that Deleuze says a concept is only valuable if it is lived, not just analyzed, not just judged. And for a concept to be lived, the writing has to open up onto other practices, and the practices have to be existential operators in their medium, the same way that the concept is an existential operator in language, so that there's a real craft of language, just like there's a craft of dancing. And what frustrates me with academic writing is it's no longer considered a craft. That it's considered, even with all of the critiques of that notion, it's considered a transparent medium of communication that brings along with it very particular conventions. So, but I think that can be done maybe without people even noticing that you're moving out of the conventional practice. If you look at Deleuze's writing, it passes in a lot of times for very traditional philosophy, but at the same time, in the rhythm of the concepts and the movement of the words, he's breaking words open so that he is inviting us to live the concepts outside the page as well.